Okay, so I mean, we came on here and we didn't really have a plan of what we wanted to talk about, but there was some wrestling stuff that you wanted to talk about, right? Is this true? That you
Well,
like we
so
were gonna like do a little dissection into some wrestling
well,
things or no?
what we're kind of talking about now was almost the idea I had for the podcast, which is just, hey, here are things we take for as givens, not just about you know life, but wrestling, because everyone who's listening to this is probably a wrestling fan. That's how they know
Yeah.
you. I'm sure you've attracted a few scragglers from other avenues or whatever, but your notoriety is from the wrestling world. So I'm assuming that a large part of your fan base is are wrestling fans.
We
And so
all
my
love
idea,
wrestling. Everything is
and
wrestling.
you know what, wrestling's fascinating. So even if you're not a wrestling fan, I thought it would be really interesting to look at wrestling as this thing that we have this general understanding of what it is, or we kind of take it at face value for what it is. But then when you start to think about it for even a minute and start to dissect things like, hey, why does it work this way? Or what are these storylines about? Or what influences this? Just why is it this way? Then I
Yeah.
think it gets really, really interesting because and that's kind of what I wanted to do. But again, I didn't do my homework well enough. So I have these
So we're just
fragmented.
spitballing here.
No, I mean, look, I have my views on things, but it's also a reflection of how I feel about other things in the world. And wrestling is just an easy way to point to it, because wrestling has sort of been my thing, my constant in my life, where I could
Yeah.
see, these things that I think about in society and the world, they're also reflected in wrestling. You know what I mean? And just drawing those parallels between these really between the humanities and wrestling, and how wrestling uses the humanities, like psychology and sociological norms and things like that, and
Mhm.
wrestling plays on all of those. So you have to have an implicit understanding of that stuff in order to do wrestling well. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So I just I'm fascinated by the humanities and by the social sciences, and I just thought wrestling, my God, it's such a reflection of so many of these things. And that's a lot of what I wanted to kind of do, is just think about some of these things that we see in wrestling a lot and go, where do you think that comes from? Or what's that about?
Sure. Sure.
Or what does this say about our society? Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's that like phrase of like everything is wrestling. I mean, so many things can either be reflected in wrestling or stem from wrestling. I mean, even you touching on like the psychology of the way that wrestling kind of comes together, it always blew my mind how much there was to know about wrestling. Like
Mm-hmm.
the psychology behind things, the why things work, why things don't work. And this is not like you can't just take like a crash course and try to figure that out. It takes years and years and years to really kind of figure out why things work and don't work. And you're constantly having to learn and evolve and like keep your finger on the pulse to figure
Yeah.
it out.
And the funny thing is, in wrestling, even a somewhat casual fan will have heard the word psychology in wrestling, but we
Mhm.
never seem to connect the very obvious dots of psychology in wrestling and psychology, the actual scientific discipline, right?
Yeah.
But that's what it is. It's not wrestling psychology and psychology. It's just psychology,
Yeah.
and it's how does wrestling prey on what we know about people and the human condition, and how do we manipulate that? You have to have a basic understanding. Actually, I'd say more than basic, a somewhat complex understanding of the human condition in order to manipulate the human condition.
And
You know what I'm
how much
saying?
and how much harder has that gotten over the years in terms of like fans awareness, how much knowledge is out there for people to know as humans are changing and like our wants and needs are changing, people's attention spans are constantly changing. Like that does that make putting together wrestling shows and matches more difficult to evolve from what wrestling matches used to be?
I'm sure in some ways, but I'm still talking about just the nuts and bolts. I'm just talking about what is wrestling, and the idea of like a good guy and a bad guy, and here's things that we say are wrong, and here's things or that are right, and here's things that make someone virtuous, and here's things that make somebody dastardly, and here are the sort of parameters and the meaning that we ascribe to things, because it's all made up.
Sure.
Right? It's all made up.
Yeah.
And that's part of the beautiful reflective nature of wrestling, is that it's not just wrestling that's all made up. It's all of it. It's all made up. You know, our social.
I feel like this is like rules. we need like Daniel Bryan on this podcast, or like Brian Kendrick. I feel like it's like
this is what I'm saying about just thinking about something for more than 10 seconds. If you take it at more than face value, like our society, these very complex things, and you start to kind of go, what's that about? Like, oh, it's all just kind of made up, right?
Yeah.
It's all like our taboos evolve with time. There are things that are taboo now that won't be taboo in 20 years, or things that were very taboo 20 years ago that are out in the open now.
What are some like examples of those like taboo things?
I don't know, just off the top of my head, let's say homosexuality.
Okay.
Right. Has changed the way we as a society look at homosexuality now versus 40 years ago.
Sure.
You know, that's just off the top of my head.
As humans,
but
certainly,
certainly out in the open and in the world of sports or whatever, you know, it's always been prevalent. But I'm just saying, it's everything's viewed differently, and everything's constantly changing. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, because things are constantly changing, you start to realize that this stuff's all kind of made up, and I don't want to say arbitrary, because there are obvious reasons why everything ends up the way it is. That's one of the things I was going to discuss is like that everything is the way it is for a reason. I think that's part of a whole bigger thing that I want to unpack. But all this to say, I lost my train of thought.
It's okay, because I'm a little lost too.